Hello and welcome to Critical Line Item. My name's Tom Ravlic. Thank you for joining me for this particular podcast. Now, amongst the professions across the globe, journalism has been one that's also been hit by the sort of coronavirus issues. People are doing things in very interesting ways, writing about very interesting issues, and sort of entering into a lot of fact checking as we sort of encounter strange people who seem to think they've got solutions to the world, otherwise known as conspiracy theorists. Now, in order to explore some of the impacts of the coronavirus on journalism, as well as some of the other issues that have cropped up that people have written about, I've got Charlie Lewis from Crikey. Charlie, for those who don't know him, writes the tips and rumours section in Crikey and occasionally dives off into other areas, which he can talk about in a little while. Charlie, thanks for joining me.
Tom, thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Now, before we dive into the pandemic and all the wonderful things that people like you and I have been looking at in terms of journalistic practice and some of the issues we've covered, Crikey is where you're at now. Can you give some idea as to what brought you to that particular juncture?
Well, so I spent most of my 20s. Crikey is my first journalism job. I was very, very lucky. That was always the place I dreamed of working, and I managed to get there first time, which is an incredible stroke of luck. But most of my 20s were sort of taken up. I worked a lot. I used to live in WA, so I worked at the state government there in employment relations. I worked in the union movement for a while, and I think I had that kind of classic thing that happens in a lot of people's late 20s where you go, there must be more than this. This is fine, but it doesn't really fulfill me. And that was kind of around the time that I started thinking I might try and turn my hand to journalism. So that's when I started studying there. And that kind of went over about 4 or so years. And just towards the end of that degree, I did work experience at Crikey and was just incredibly lucky. I happened to graduate just as they were looking for someone to replace, or they were looking for someone to be a new reporter there. And I happened to have just done work experience there, and I managed to obviously not completely buff it up because they asked me to come join them. So and so I've been there ever since. And I've worked in various roles at Crikey, kind of generalist reporter. And now, as you say, I'm the editor of the Tips and Murmurs column, which is a sort of collection of slightly smaller stories, kind of insider knowledge and things like
that. Now, it's clear that, and people won't see this, so I need to explain the visuals to them. We are both working from the places we live.
Yes.
At the current time. How challenging is it to think of the place you live as the place you work? Because, when you leave for the office, you sort of walk out the door. You go off, you see all your workmates, and then you finish the day, and you go, and home becomes your refuge. How is it now for you when you're working from home, and does the day bleed?
Oh yeah, there's definitely a risk of that. And I suppose, one thing you'd have to sort of preface anything about working from home with is that being a journalist with full-time work is a very privileged position to be in, and to have a job that you can continue to maintain while working from home is obviously very lucky. And there's a lot of industries that have been decimated because they can't work that way, and again, this is a sort of bit of a side note, but one of the huge reasons for so many of the outbreaks that we've seen in the last 16 months is that people have got insecure work that they can't afford to not go out and continue to do, even if they are sick or they're not feeling well or they're at risk. So I should obviously preface any kind of self-pity with the knowledge that I'm extremely, extremely lucky to have the conditions that I have. I suppose, as I say, I think a lot of what you talk about is exactly right. The idea that the day sort of the workday bleeds into the personal life, and the idea that I go and sit on my couch and I can still see my workspace, which is it's kind of can be hard to switch off that way. And I think also the other thing that kind of that is very much missing since this kind of great shift has happened is one of the great things about working in a newsroom with a lot of people that you really admire, really respect, is just the collegiate atmosphere and the ability to bounce ideas off one another, the idea to quickly fact check with something when you're not quite sure if you're looking in the right area, quickly discuss a story idea with an editor. All of those things now take longer or are kind of elongated by the process of working from home when you're relying on Slack and you're not sure if you can get through to someone on the phone. That's it. I think in terms of working conditions, I do suspect that in terms of working from home, that's probably, journalism is one of the better jobs to have to work from home for, because a lot of the tools that you need to be able to do it are still available to you. Ultimately, if you've got a working laptop and a mobile phone, you can usually get a story together. But with all those caveats.
It's interesting you talk about things like the use of Slack and whatever else. In my situation, you are in the case of what I do, I'm doomed to an existence of being a professional nuisance. Because when you're outside of an office climate, you might submit something for publication, but because the internal cohort exudes a degree of power, it doesn't matter what the organization is, right? You got to be it's got to be a pretty good yarn from a freelancer to make it in, firstly. Secondly, the communication channels an editor's got immediately sort of in the building, in their face. And it's amazing how long it takes to get the communication through. So that's an interesting point you make in terms of comms. And then you flip it around and start thinking about the things you have to cover, because isolation creates a completely different dynamic, doesn't it? I mean, Cameron Wilson and yourself have occasionally touched on. Let me find a description that's less pejorative than I normally use.
Okay.
But let's call them. Let's just call them conspiracy theorists for the moment. I can. Sure. I don't think for more colour is required here, but I think what we've observed is a gradual descent into something that looks like science fiction being viewed as fact by a whole part of the populace. How do you see that phenomenon from where you sit, having written about some of it, but also observing it online?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And this was a point I was going to get into a little bit later, but I think like with so many issues that are suddenly incredibly stark during the era of COVID, it's not actually that the pandemic necessarily brought them about. It's that the conditions that the pandemic imposed just shone a light right on them. And I think conspiratorial thinking and its prevalence online is a really good example of that. We have had, for at least a decade, but probably longer, a very powerful conspiratorial movement online that was focused first on climate change, and that got a lot of, which then bled into the mainstream, and now it's a very regular series of talking points in our only national broadsheet that takes a lot of this thinking to be scientifically valid. Then you kind of got it with President Trump, especially focused around President Trump in the US, a very, very conspiracy theory-led politician, someone whose whole claim to legitimacy was that the system that elected him was not legitimate. And then he could rely back on that once he was actually voted out of office. And we all saw where that led on January 6th with the attack on the Capitol building, which is also, again, this then has found very sympathetic reading in a lot of mainstream publications, both in Australia and outside. And it's also found a sympathetic reading with a lot of coalition backbenchers who now, or former coalition backbenchers now, in the case of people like Craig Kelly, who build their entire audience on these kind of conspiratorial talking points.
I guess you could call their post fan fiction.
Yeah, I think that, that might actually not be a bad way to put it. I mean, I think Hey, my sort of idea of him is that he's someone who does latch upon. There's a bit of fan fiction on him. It used to be Tony Abbott fan fiction, and then Tony Abbott got voted out of power, and I think he just graduated to Trump. That's my view, but that's probably by the by. Yeah. So as you say, it's a real challenge, and it's getting worse, not better. And I'm genuinely at a bit of a loss as to what the mainstream's role is in combating that, because we have, for reasons good and ill, done a lot to hurt our own credibility with people. People don't generally believe what they read in the newspaper anymore, for good and bad reasons. So you have now situations like, for example, the anti-lockdown, which I think, the anti-lockdown protests in Sydney and in Melbourne weren't just conspiracy theorists, but that was obviously a huge nexus of what organized that movement.
You talk in that space. We can sort of touch on the actual salad bowl of ideologies you get, and that's what it is. That's what it is. That's what we see. People will converge, but they will converge for their own reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And the danger that we face every time people say, well, they're just right-wing nutters. Well, they might not be right-wing nutters. There may be people who are genuine libertarians, or there may be people who are losing money because their small business is suffering, or they've lost a job, or whatever else. Their motivation may be completely different to the QAnon kook, to the
anti-vaxxer,
you've got QAnon, you've got the sovereign citizens, you've got the anti-vaxxers, you've got the 5G is here to reprogram you and everything else.
Yeah.
And all those things converge into something that appears to be a freedom rally. The nuance that's missing in the coverage or even the commentary online, it sometimes staggers me. A disclosure: I've had to read a lot of stuff from extremist movements over the past 4 years. And for me, it's now second nature to try and weed it out. But how challenging is it to sort of isolate these things when you look at it, Charlie? To sort of pick out the things that are present, and not necessarily overhype them, because we know that the people that are part of certain movements like having the name of their movement mentioned. Right? How do you reasonably? How do you do it? How do you cover this stuff in proportion? Is probably the right way to put it.
It's very challenging. You're exactly right. It's a very, very challenging process of assessing what is genuinely in the public interest to reveal and what is merely servicing a group that thrives on notoriety, whether it's good or bad. And I think ultimately it does come down to a bit of a, like a lot of journalism, it comes down to a case-by-case basis and a little bit of, I guess, your judgment about what these things do. I mean, I often, you've mentioned my colleague Cameron. I mean, I often see to him in a lot of these things, because he has, like yourself, he's spent a lot of time in looking at these specific groups before even they were being animated by the pandemic and when they were animated by other movements.
Oh, yeah.
So he so often he'd be someone I'd want to talk about that kind of, about whether I'm doing good or bad work in calling this sort of stuff, calling attention to this kind of thing. Yeah, and I think also, just to an extent, just I think also the thing that we never like to really admit as journalists is that we have our own emotional reactions, our own visceral reactions to certain events that make us predisposed to have certain conclusions about them. And so I think a lot of the commentary, as you say, some of the staggering commentary about the so-called freedom rally, completely lacking any nuance and quite smug and quite self-satisfied in writing them off as a monolith group of nut jobs, comes from the fact that maybe people didn't check their own anger. Because it's very understandable. You look at that and you think, this Sydney is already struggling with COVID. This is such a dangerous move. It's very understandable to react emotionally to that, but you also have one of the big things about trying to disassociate yourself from your own emotional reaction and make sure that you're being kind of fair and genuinely objective, which is, obviously the challenge in every situation.
Well, that's actually a good point that you've just raised, because it comes back to this phenomenon of, to what extent are you as the journalist a part of the story that's unfolding, right? And it's fascinating to just observe it. The thing now, things unfold in commentary across the board. For example, when I've looked at the reaction online from journalists and others to the QAnon story that ran on Four Corners, and we've done some stuff in Crikey on that as well. And I've sat there and I've watched people talk about national security threats, and interestingly, I looked at the evidence presented in that with a rather privileged set of eyes looking at it. It cost me something like $35,000, but let's not go there. But with a privileged set of eyes, and I've looked at it and I've gone, it would be nice to know whether a particular word was inserted into a speech on the basis of inspiration or whatever else. But I haven't seen any evidence that tells me someone's a national security threat. I've just seen two blokes talking each other up on Signal.
Right.
Hey, yeah. And those are the kinds of things that occur to me looking at a situation with a different set of eyes, education in a particular space, and also probably being 49 helps as well. I can't get a decent beard because mine grays, but that's all right. You're lucky you can.
It's a pretty patchy effort, but your listeners don't need to know about that.
No, they didn't. I'm starting to regret mentioning it myself. But it's about the perspective, I guess, and how you see it and how involved you get into the actual fact pattern. How challenging is that? I've tended to try and look at things in as detached a way as I possibly can. That can be really tough.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, going back to the commentary on the Freedom Rally, it's a good example of that, because I think most of the people who are paid to write commentary in Australia are, well-educated people with fairly secure work who can't conceive of any version of attending a rally like that doesn't involve just complete delusion and conspiratorial thinking. They may understand it intellectually, but it doesn't seem to occur to them at the first draft. Yeah, and I suppose, there are sort of other ways in which I suppose that kind of culture has made itself felt during the pandemic. But I think we can probably get to that later.
What are the things we can get to that now? What are the sort of cultural things that you're seeing emerge? I know what I'm seeing emerge, but I'm actually interested in what someone with a slightly younger mindset sees at the present time.
Well, I suppose once again, I think there's the like I was saying before, the idea of the pandemic as an X-ray, the idea that it shows you where things are broken. One of the things that I think has been really interesting is watching the coverage of over the last 16 months of just the general coverage of the political response to the pandemic. That's the thing that's really sort of preoccupied me. I think this has always been the case. But it really does become starkly available once you start really looking closely during a time of crisis like this. I think that the need of the mainstream media to create and then perpetuate and maintain a kind of agreed upon narrative that everyone kind of feeds on has been a huge issue. And I think Scott Morrison, whatever else is about him, has benefited from that more than any prime minister I can recall. I was just thinking back of this, especially in the early days of the pandemic, the way that the COVID Safe app was covered, with most of the newspapers saying that you're an anti-vaxxer if you didn't want to give the government that kind of information about your whereabouts, or if you weren't a terrorist, you had nothing to worry about. Or the coverage of the collaboration with the union movement and how this was going to be a new accord. And there was an incredible reluctance to revisit any of these points when they turned out not to be true. When the COVID Safe app turned out not to have done anything very much to help us with the pandemic, no one seemed to go back to their old commentary and go, actually, I got that wrong. This wasn't that good an idea. When the government abandoned completely the collaborative approach with the union movement in terms of developing a new reform to employment law in the response to the pandemic, and then put forward an omnibus bill, which was exactly what you would expect from a coalition government taking talking points from the business groups. Again, no one went, wait a minute, I thought we were supposed to have an accord in play. The 4-point plan from a couple of weeks ago. I don't remember the last time I heard that phrase, but it was a big deal for a week, and everyone kind of got on board with that. And obviously, I'm not saying that journalists have been completely credulous and haven't interrogated the government. Of course they have. And there's been lots of really great work in the last few years. I don't want to overgeneralize, but the idea that the idea was like latched onto quite early on that the coalition had become, in the face of this crisis, a kind of bipartisan, non-political problem-solving unit, and that was all that was going to be going forward. And at every moment, I think we've seen that that's not really the case. And I don't know how much for example, I think it may have been today, it was definitely this week, the AFR ran a piece saying what the real problem with Scott Morrison's response now and what he needs to do leading up to the next election is to stop being so apolitical and really get down to the politics of the matter if he wants to win the next election. And I think anyone thinking that the real problem with Scott Morrison is he's not capable of politics is maybe a little off in their analysis from my point of
view. I think your call on that one is actually quite sound.
Thank you, Tom.
If nothing else, Scott Morrison is a political animal. I don't, and we have all these discussions about the Prime Minister's faith and the weird things people discover about some of his friends.
Yeah.
And I sit back and I go, well, forget the King James Bible. Go and grab a read of Machiavelli and understand how people work to win power. It doesn't always have anything to do with religion. Religion might be useful. They may have a personal connection to religion, but it may be completely divorced with the way in which they seek to attain and maintain power. Right? I see the things as being separate and distinct. Other people might think I'm crazy, but that's okay. We're a broad church, no pun intended.
Yeah.
But I think it's about understanding the dynamic of power and how power is exercised, as opposed to whether people think politicians with a religion are strange or weird or do use their faith in an inappropriate way or whatever. I don't see that as needing to enter into the conversation necessarily.
Except when it has a direct influence on someone's policy, which to some extent it has a little bit with Morrison. I mean, obviously, but then again, I suspect the Religious Freedoms Bill, which has been sort of bubbling away in the background for longer than any of us care to remember. I suspect any coalition government would have embraced that kind of reform, and indeed they have since Abbott. Again, another person who's obviously been who the detention between his personal faith and his political moves has obviously been a real kind of topic of conversation. But I think that was just more grist for the culture war mill, to be honest, rather than some kind of desire to put in some kind of Pentecostal theocracy in Australia.
Yeah, that's where I'm coming. That's where I'm coming from, which is exercise of power is an interesting study in itself, and I owe my knowledge of Machiavelli, by the way, to the fact that we did the Year 12 VCE HSC English theme called Power and Politics.
Mm.
We had 4 books. Machiavelli's The Prince was one of them. Robert Bolt's A Man for All Seasons.
Uh-huh.
George Orwell's 1984. And a collection of Nelson Mandela's speeches, which is No Easy Walk to Freedom.
Interesting. It's quite a combo of 20th century, well, not 20th century figures, but quite a combo of figures there.
Oh yeah. So when you sit back and you look at you look at that as a person undertaking Year 12 studies, and then you realise it was probably one of the best things to happen to you. A little while then later. Also, in terms of covering politics, there's something else I've noticed. Aside from the narrative, is what happens when the narrative gets broken. We've seen this in the past 3 or 4 weeks when the term gold standard all of a sudden goes from New South Wales is doing it better than anybody else, particularly Victoria, to gold standard turning into this term that doesn't denote anything related to success, let alone affection towards the New South Wales Premier. Are you seeing it the same way?
Yeah. I mean, that was, again, that was a very dispiriting, and I again, mustn't let my own personal feelings as someone who lived in Victoria during the big lockdown of 2020 sort of colour my judgment here too much. But it was an extremely dispiriting time to watch the federal government. Really, again, I don't know if that was anything. I don't think it was anything beyond political opportunism to latch upon the idea that New South Wales was the gold standard and that Victoria had failed its people so horrendously. And that's why the second that it became even mildly inconvenient to stay in the corner of the New South Wales government, they were immediately abandoned by the federal government, because for me, that was to do with nothing at all beyond political opportunism. And I wonder how that's going to affect the coalition in the next election. I can't imagine that voters, for example, in Josh Frydenberg's election, are going his electorate are going to forget him getting up in Parliament day after day and exploiting their situation for political gain. I can't imagine that's going to be forgotten anytime soon. So as I say, I don't think that comes down to any great. Again, it's the exercise of power, like you said before. It's merely, and that has been another recurring theme of the Morrison government, is merely putting as much space between himself and any kind of responsibility for things going wrong as could possibly be there. So of course he won't take responsibility for the fact that he incorrectly assessed the New South Wales government there. Also, I mean, to be fair to New South Wales, for the longest time, that appeared to be a pretty safe bet. They had, beyond all things, kept outbreaks to a minimum, avoided locking down. They had a good experience of COVID up until this year. It's to be fair on them, I don't think that the gold standard idea came from nowhere.
Oh, I completely get that. And better state management at that time in that context was probably justified some plaudits, but maybe not necessarily gold standard. Which
no, that was short-sighted and was always a risky choice of phrase.
Oh yeah, things easily turn around in politics as well, very, very rapidly. And the other thing with the narrative is that what you've seen develop in the media as well is there was a tendency to comment on Victoria versus New South Wales over a period of time. Mm-hmm. Then all of a sudden, this thing happens in New South Wales. And then people have to reassess how they deal with it. So not only have you got people who previously pointed to New South Wales as the way it should be done. New South Wales locks down, and it's like, hold on a second, we can't use that anymore.
Yeah.
Gladys has gone down the rabbit hole, and she's not coming out for at least a month, if not longer. Sorry to depress you, Charlie, but it's how the media, how certain commentators seem to pivot.
Yeah.
Try to pivot their way out of a situation. So if it's not Victoria versus New South Wales, it's the feds versus the states, or it's the city versus the country. That is, the regional areas that have no COVID suffering, and the city that's got COVID, and we're all in this together. But really, the regional guy should be let off the leash because there's no disease there. It's an interesting kind of dilemma.
It is, absolutely, and it points to the fact that COVID, especially as we get more and more new variants that are more contagious or more difficult to contain, it's not going to allow us to have any kind of easy one size fits all narrative in place. And as you say, it's a very attractive storytelling motif, if nothing else, to have a nice, easy, clean conflict in the center of it, whether it's Melbourne versus Sydney,
absolutely,
country versus city, state versus federal, regardless of the validity of that. Although the state versus federal thing is a very interesting thing, I think that will end up being a very, very significant.
That's slightly,
which is
that's a genuine point of tension, and looks at the nature of our federalism. But you said something interesting a moment ago, which may be worth expanding on briefly, and that is, these things don't necessarily allow us to have a ready-made narrative to hand. Why should we be able to have a ready-made narrative to hand?
It's a very good question, and I think once more it points to a fundamental problem that journalism, I think, has sort of always had a little bit, which is the need to generate a take every single day. There has to be, you've got to fill those pages with something, and sometimes it will require overlooking, Well, there's a wonderful line in Joan Didion's. She did a collection of writing about the presidential election in various presidential elections. I think this was one from the 1998 race, where she talks about various media events, which she and a whole group of high-profile journalists would witness, and everyone would go off and write the exact same story, and overlooking things that had actually happened. And she would say that everyone would overlook observable facts because you need to preserve the agreed-upon narrative. So I think that's always been an issue. When you have a kind of fast-moving crisis like COVID, it just makes that all the more absurd and all the more obvious.
Absolutely. It's also and real life isn't that clear cut. Not everyone that is painted as a villain is necessarily a ironclad boilerplate villain of any story. The real life is actually, as opposed to some certain storytelling, there's a richness in the tapestry of somebody's life.
Absolutely, yeah.
And picking off different things because they suit a particular line of argument is an interesting part of what we do, but it's not necessarily the thing that we should be most proud of when the end product ends up being less than gold standard.
Yes, it's a useful phrase, as it turns out. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, another sort of recurring theme of the pandemic coverage has been the ease of reaching for a scapegoat, the quickness to latch upon to certain hate figures. Now, I feel like it's pretty inarguable that the things that have decided that have not been the objective facts necessarily of someone's conduct. I can't help but notice that it's much more likely that if someone is working class or a person of color, they've broken COVID restrictions, they are much more likely to be identified and have their face on the front of a newspaper. Whereas if someone comes back from Aspen, for example, to pick a random example, someone comes back from Aspen and hasn't followed the right.
That's a random example, yeah.
This is a random example. They have their anonymity protected. Yes, so as you say, there's no objective quality that qualifies you for villain status. It's often, or if there is, it's maybe one that we wouldn't really like to admit.
Yeah, Charlie, I'm very conscious of time, and I'm grateful that we've had this opportunity to chat about some important issues. Is there anything else that you noticed about the way we reported stuff in the pandemic that's worthwhile mentioning that we haven't touched on?
I think the only other thing that kind of really occurred to me while I was thinking about having our chat was another one of those sort of absurdities of journalism, which has been just laid even more bare by the pandemic, is the obsession with being an insider, or at least giving the impression that you're some sort of insider. The number of high-profile journalists tweeting out, in some cases, inaccurate numbers, or simply the vague allusion to, oh, I've heard the numbers are very bad today, which I can only see as a demonstration of your clout. There's no public interest in a journalist saying, I hear the numbers out of New South Wales this morning are going to be terrible. What am I to do with that information apart from panic and think, well, that guy obviously knows someone in the New South Wales government? That would be another absurdity, I think, that is very clear during the pandemic.
But that's something else as well that's worthwhile making a point before we sort of get you to explain to people where they can find your stuff. Which I always do, because finding your stuff is important. But we mentioned earlier, and I've been negligent in failing to point this out, but I'll do it now. We mentioned earlier that people move on from certain things very quickly. We've mentioned earlier that, and you've now mentioned the fact that social media has allowed people to have their own megaphone, right? The part of the problem, and please give me a kick in the shins if you disagree, I think is the way in which the current media climate tends to be shaped, at least in part, by people's inability to have a longer attention span than that of the length of a Bluey episode. Then also the inability of people to refrain from simply relying on Twitter or a social media feed for an update. The role of social media, I think, in building up personalities of journalists as being bigger than the actual story, as well as the role of social media in dumbing down discourse, I think is an area that we need to focus more on to improve our craft. That is to try and avoid that rather than perpetuate it. Am I just being an old fart here, or do I have a point?
No. I think you've definitely got a point. I think the slightly schizophrenic quality of a lot of engaging with especially media Twitter on a day-to-day basis, I think what that's done to my brain, I hate to think. And I think it also does, it reinforces a certain idea that a lot of journalism isn't necessarily for public consumption. It's for your other friends in the media to read. It's letters between journalists and public. But again, I think my short answer is I think that's definitely a huge concern. I think a longer answer might require another episode.
Look, you're on. We'll do that, but and we'll plan for that. But I think the other thing that is risky, and I don't know how you deal with it in the current climate, but I think it's risky. Again, kick me in the shins if you think I'm gone off the rails, right? But in the old days, story gets published. That's all anybody sees. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
They don't see a journalist's tweets on what they've written, or they don't see a journalist's argument between, politicians about what they've written, or in the way, or a journalist's handling of various public comments on Twitter, etc., about what they've written. Does social media taint the perception of what may well be an independent piece of reportage because of the way people in journalism use it?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I suppose I've never been a working journalist prior to the Twitter era, so I wouldn't feel very comfortable making any broad statements about that. I mean, I think there's a certain element that what you describe, if it taints journalism, it also in a strange way has the potential to, I think, really strengthen it, because you are more accountable than ever in some ways to your readers about what you've reported and what you've claimed. But beyond that, I probably wouldn't want to make any big statements about that. I think there's pluses and minuses to that side of.
Yeah, I agree with you, but it's an interesting thing that we haven't yet come to terms with, and that is, how does a viewer or how does a reader take what is written, Article A versus Twitter feed, and then put the two together and say, somebody says to you, "Oh no, I'm more me on Twitter, but my story is something else," and then people start to put the two together and say, "Yes, but you're clearly biased here, or you're clearly biased there."
It's an interesting one. And as I say, I can see both sides of that one. I think in some ways, having a better understanding of the personal views of a journalist may be not such a bad thing when you critically assess their work.
But if someone's a commentator, like in St. Andrew Bolt, you fully expect to see opinion, and that it's not. It's never portrayed as being straight journalism, for example, that somebody else might do on television, online, in print, and on radio, obviously, or podcasts like this too. But that seems to be a convenient way to sort of wrap things up, because there's a soccer match to watch a little later. Charlie, thanks for joining me. Where can people find your stuff?
So I'm published every day, every weekday at crikey.com.au, which is where you can get subscriptions to our daily newsletter. And yes, I do a daily column called Tips and Moments.
And then there's obviously the occasional feature piece of Guide Stamp. Pay attention to what Charlie writes. It's always interesting. Thank you for joining me, Charlie. It's been a privilege to talk to you.
It's been great fun, Tom. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolute pleasure. And no doubt we'll catch up again.
Absolutely.